So this is the Bible study for Exodus chapter 5. And our text for today says, afterward, Moses and Aaron went to Pharaoh and said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Pharaoh said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with the sword. But the king of Egypt said, Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to work. Then Pharaoh said, look, the people of the land are now numerous, and you are stopping them from working. That same day, the Pharaoh gave his order to the slave drivers and overseers in charge of the people. You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out. Let us go and sacrifice to our God. Make the work harder for the people so that they keep working and pay no attention to lies. Then the slave drivers and the overseers went out and said to the people, this is what Pharaoh says, I will not give you any more straw. Go and get your own straw wherever you can find it, but your work will not be reduced at all. So the people scattered all over Egypt to gather stubble to use for straw. The slave drivers kept pressing them, saying, complete the work required for you each day, just as when you had straw. And Pharaoh's slave drivers beat the Israelite overseers they had appointed, demanding, why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today as before? Then the Israelite overseers went and appealed to Pharaoh, why have you treated your servants this way? Your servants are given no straw, yet we are told make bricks. Your servants are being beaten, but the fault is with your own people. Pharaoh said, lazy, that's what you are, lazy. That is why you keep saying, let us go sacrifice to the Lord. Now get to work. You will not be given any straw, yet you must produce the full quota of bricks. The Israelite overseers realized they were in trouble when they were told, you are not to reduce the number of bricks required of you for each day. When they left Pharaoh, they found Moses and Aaron waiting to meet them, and they said, may the Lord look on you and judge you. You have made us obnoxious to Pharaoh and his officials and have put a sword in their hand to kill us. Moses returned to the Lord and said, why, Lord? Why have you brought trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. Okay. So remember that you can download PDF versions of the Bible study so that you can follow along with us as we ask the questions about the text at www.abqnaz.org/alive. And number 1 on our Bible study says, what happened in last week's Bible study? A, Moses began his return to Egypt. B, on the way, God tried to kill Moses. See, Moses's wife circumcised their son and touched the foreskin to Moses's foot, or threw it perhaps at God's feet, depending on the translation. D, Aaron met Moses at the mountain of God, and they continued on to call the elders of Israel together. So that was pretty much the story of what happened last week. It was an odd story. But that's what we talked about. All of that kind of coming after the time when the week before Moses had asked God to send someone else, even after God had given him signs and things like that he could show to Pharaoh and the people that would show that God is really with them and that he had really heard from God and all of that. Number 2, what happened in 5:1? So in 5:1, Moses and Aaron actually went to Pharaoh, and this is where they're doing what God told them to do and saying, let us go out into the wilderness and hold a festival, worshiping the Lord. And they said, this is what the Lord, the God of Israel says. Number 3 says, how did Pharaoh respond according to 5:2? He said, who is the Lord that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go. It's really interesting because, you know, God is God, and God is not just the God of the Israelites. God is a God. I mean, Pharaoh eventually learns. We haven't got to that place yet, but Pharaoh will eventually learn that God is God, and there's a reason he should listen to him. The plagues that come upon Egypt and really cause much pain become the answer to Pharaoh's question. That's who the Lord is, and that's why you should listen to him. But I would say that a lot of people who don't know the Lord, if they hear this is what the Lord says, they have this same response. So until God shows himself real, until God shows himself true, they have thus saith the Lord really has very little weight with them. And that doesn't necessarily mean we shouldn't say it, because I do think we should declare what the Lord teaches us and what he tells us. But I don't think we should be surprised that people that don't know the Lord and don't believe in the Lord and don't trust in the Lord are not doing what the Lord says. So I think that's interesting. One of the things that the church, I think, constantly sort of makes a mistake about is we can't figure out why we go around telling everybody what God says and nobody seems to care. And the truth is, if they're not following God, if they don't trust in him and know that he's real, they have no reason to do what he says. And it's one reason why quoting scripture to non-believers is not necessarily an effective evangelistic tool. I mean, we can at some level we should, I think, tell people what God says. We ought to evangelize, but let me get to the end of this so that you don't think I'm saying, oh, don't go tell anybody anything about God. That's not what I'm saying. But what I'm saying is that the best tool that we have to evangelize is our witness, where we tell people who God is to us and who he has been to us, because I really believe that the salvation that we've received is something that everybody needs. And they may not realize they need it, but when they hear the story of the change that happened from when we didn't have God in our life and he wasn't looking with favor upon us, to what happened when he encountered us and began the transformation in our life, I think people will see that that's what they need. Whereas if we start saying, thus saith the Lord, thou shalt not, that doesn't carry any weight for somebody who doesn't love the Lord. Now, I do think that there's something to be said for saying this is what is right, and this is why we believe this is what is right. This is what we don't believe you should do. And our culture has kind of run wild with some of these things that God has specifically said not to do, and I think we should share that. But I don't think that's our primary evangelistic tool. I think that is an opportunity for God to bring conviction. But I don't think it is particularly compelling. I don't think if you go around saying thou shalt not commit adultery, that people are going to say, oh, you're right, let me turn to the Lord. I don't think that's a common response. I think what Pharaoh said is actually a more common response. Who is the Lord, and why should I listen to him? And the reality is, so I believe that the witness that we have is the answer to that question. So this is who the Lord is. This is who the Lord's been to me. And this is what happened when I began to listen to him. And this is why you should listen to him. So ultimately, God shows himself to Pharaoh in a way that probably is not the way we want most people to experience God. And that is through plagues and wrath, to make sure that he ultimately does what God says, whether he likes it or not. Because he's compelled by the misery that he's experiencing in not doing what God says. And I will say that that's where a lot of people will get to if they don't come to know God in the easy way. If they don't come to God willingly, there's going to be a time when they're going to be in such misery that they'll need to turn somewhere. And I think God allows that to happen in people's lives, and perhaps even in this case, it appears causes that to happen. And so, but to be honest with you, the people that I love, I'd rather they didn't have to go through that. I'd rather that they come to trust in God without that misery. And so I want to do all that I can to tell them who the Lord is and why we should listen to him in sort of a positive light, because there's going to be a day when it's going to come from the negative side, and they may or may not respond then either. But anyway, let's move on. Number 4. What did Moses and Aaron say when Pharaoh responded in this way, according to 5:3? A, they left discouraged, but who expected anything else? Or B, they declared that God had told them he may strike them with plagues or sword if they did not go out and sacrifice. So the next thing they said, was, this is what we believe will happen if we don't do what God says. And that's important because they actually don't say God will strike you down if you don't. But actually they said, we know what God's told us, and we don't want to experience the wrath of God if we don't do what God has told us to do. And so in the end, they do everything God has told them to do, but Pharaoh doesn't respond. And it's not Israel who's struck with plagues. In fact, Israel, I'm getting ahead of ourselves, but in the Passover, Israel, if they put the blood of the lamb on the doorpost, was saved from the plagues, whereas Egypt was not. And so it really became a very, very definitive and very clear: if you do what I tell you, then you will be spared from this plague. If you do not do what I tell you, then you won't. And it ends up being Pharaoh and all of Egypt that is struck with the plagues, while at least the worst of the plagues, particularly the plague of the firstborn, Israel is spared from. So they were just laying out what they knew to be the consequences of not following God. And let me just say that we've lost in our current culture, even in the church, I think, the understanding of the consequences of not following God. The grace has been proclaimed in a way that almost would convince us that we don't have to follow God, and he's going to be kind to us anyway. And by the way, that is the definition of grace, is unmerited favor. But that grace is offered as a new start, as a new as a clean slate, not as an opportunity to continue to disobey God. And so we've kind of got to the place where we think that there are no consequences for disobeying God at all anymore as well. So perhaps it is important to declare there are consequences for not following God. But I really do think that the way Moses declare it, they point out for them as followers of God, there are consequences for us, and they don't go around saying God's going to strike you dead. In the end, I mean, they warn Pharaoh of each of the plagues and that sort of thing. So there's some of that, but I just remember, I go back to the New Testament and I read what Paul says, and he says, are we not to judge those inside the church? So he says that judgment needs to start with the people of God, and we have a tendency to go around declaring ourselves righteous and suggest that it seems like the judgment is going to start outside the church. So I really do think that we need to start that way, with an understanding, instead of dividing the holy from the unholy or the righteous from the unrighteous. There's a natural division that happens. There's a line that's drawn. But in our talking about God, we need to understand that we are among those who will be judged. We are not separate from those who being judged. So we don't draw a line in between us and them. That line will be drawn by the judgment. But rather, we declare the truth of God. We declare hope in God, in Christ, and we do point out what can happen if not just they or you, if we don't follow the Lord. This is what's going to happen. And I think that can make a big difference in how we talk about God. Number 5, how did Pharaoh respond after this? According to 5:4-21. A, he said Moses and Aaron were distracting the Israelites from their work. B, he made it harder to make bricks, demanding the Israelites gather their own straw and provide it instead of providing it to them. C, he said the Israelites are lazy and that's why they're crying out. If their work is harder, they won't have time to complain. And D, he turned Israel against Moses and Aaron by making them the reason things got worse. So that's what Pharaoh did. He said, okay, you guys obviously have too much time on your hands. You want to go out and worship God and all this stuff. You're obviously got too much free time, and it's allowing you to complain and think about what you wish you had or what you wish didn't happen. And so I'm going to make your work harder so you don't have any time to think about complaining. And he told them exactly why he was doing it, which in the end, the Israelite overseers, so Egypt had slave drivers, but they used Israelites, their own people, to oversee the rest of the slaves. And those Israelite overseers came to Moses. Well, Moses and Aaron met them on their way from Pharaoh, and their response was, Moses and Aaron, why have you made trouble for us? So the people, it's kind of ironic, but the people that God has sent to deliver Israel are now being accused of making things worse. And in some ways, it does seem like they did. Now we got to trust that God is not finished in this situation, and that but it did get worse before it got better. And Moses and Aaron became the people that, Pharaoh was intentionally trying to keep them from listening to Moses and Aaron, turn them against them, so that they were inciting these problems. And can I get them to stop listening to Moses and Aaron altogether? And so it was an intentional thing that Pharaoh was doing. Number 6, how did Moses respond to this? According to verses 22 and 23. Now, this is maybe the most interesting part of this whole text. And we learn a lot about Moses through what's written in Exodus, and not always in a good way, but at least in a way that's human, and I think we can understand and we can connect with. So we'd like to say, A, he trusted God because this is exactly what God said would happen. And God did say Pharaoh won't listen unless I move my mighty hand. But so this is exactly what God said would happen, but that's not what Moses did. B, he asked God why. He did ask God why. By the way, this is a prayer that I think a lot of us have prayed when we do what God says and things don't seem to go as we had planned for them to go, or as we thought they should, and doesn't feel like God is doing what he said he was going to do. So we ask God why. See, he began to believe the lie that they would have been better off not to make waves at all. So you hear Moses saying, why, Lord, have you brought this trouble on this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he has brought trouble on this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. So there seems to be regret, and he has taken what the Israelite overseers have said to him and taken it personally and believed that lie and said, yep, I shouldn't have done this. And I would say this, that as Christians, when people bring accusation against us for doing the will of God, it is very easy and very common for us to believe the lie and then go back to God with a belief in this lie. And ultimately, I want to say this, I don't think it's wrong for us to ask God why. I don't think it's wrong for us to, if we don't understand, for us to go to God and try to understand and ask for guidance and help and clarity on, am I really doing what you said? Is this really what you said? But one of the things, Pastor Bain used to say this about Jesus, when Jesus was accused, when Jesus was called, Beelzebub, or in league with the devil, essentially, when Jesus was accused of casting out demons in the name of Satan, essentially. Pastor Bain, our previous pastor, used to say, I don't think Jesus was there saying, oh, maybe I am. I'm so, is that what I'm doing? Because Jesus had so much confidence in what God the Father had said to him, because he knew that he knew that he knew about his relationship with God. And now I think there's a balance where it's okay to go back to God within that relationship and ask God, are you sure? I need clarity. I want to make sure I did what you said, and I don't understand what just happened. I don't understand the outcome. And I don't think it's sinful to do that. In fact, I think some of that conversation with God can help build our relationship and our understanding of the heart of God. However, we need to be careful and stop short of accusing God in arrogance. And I really wonder about the end of what Moses said. And he says, and you have not rescued your people at all, because there's really an accusation coming against God at this point, where Moses doesn't, at some point in this conversation with God, it doesn't feel like Moses is coming to God for clarity and understanding. It feels like Moses has joined the team of the Israelites who are mad at God and who don't believe that God is really trustworthy or is doing what he said he was going to do. And so Moses brings accusation against God. And I really think that that's a step too far, and we need to be able to understand the difference. And I know that God knows our heart, and whether we say it or what we don't say, I think God knows what we mean, and he knows. So if we don't say it and we really mean it, he knows. If we say it but he knows that we're really trying to understand and we're just kind of throwing our arms up, he knows. And so I don't want to get really legalistic about what you can say to God and what you can't say to God. But what I do want to say is, I think the heart of this is that talking to God in faith, and trying to understand his ways, which are different from how we would have done it, is a different thing than really hearing the accusations and hearing the lies that the enemy brings through the people around us, and taking them to God as their representative, like we believe them over God. And so that's really what's happening, because see, God is not finished here, and we know the end of this story, so it's a little bit easier for us to talk about. A lot of times in our lives, we don't know the end of the story. We don't know what's about to happen. And so God has told us to do things. God has made promises to us. And at some point, we still don't know what the outcome is going to be. And sometimes when the outcome looks bad, or the current, outcome is a funny word, because outcome assumes finality. It assumes that the whole thing is done and this is the outcome. And a lot of times we're judging the outcome before the whole thing is done, and God knows the future. And so that's one of the challenges, right? So we're looking at a situation, and the outcome that we see doesn't look like what we had been promised and what we were trying to accomplish when we obeyed God. And we can begin to believe that God is not going to be faithful, and that what God has done or called us to do has not accomplished what it was supposed to accomplish, and that what really has happened is that it has made things worse, and so let's stop. I know a lot of people, this is something that happens a lot, is when we're disobedient to God and we're ultimately serving ourselves, and doing the bidding of the enemy. We're ultimately doing what Satan says, because he causes us to idolize ourselves. He leads us to do what is best for us instead of what's best for God. It's his most effective trick. And when we're serving Satan, and I'm not talking about some weird Satan worship or whatever, I'm just talking about when we serve ourselves and do the will of the enemy instead of the will of God, Satan has no reason to attack. He's happy with us. We're his friends. The day we make a commitment to God, all of a sudden we're his enemy, and he turns on us, and he wants to attack, and he wants to destroy. And so I know a lot of people that have made a commitment to Christ and begun serving Christ, and it immediately got harder, just like this, just like what's happening with the Israelites. And so God is bringing about salvation, but when he comes and shows up and brings about salvation, man, the enemy gets mad, and the enemy starts attacking, because the enemy knows that right now, at the beginning of this decision, you're most likely to turn back. Many years down the road, when you've learned to trust in God, and you've learned the tricks of the enemy, and you've started to recognize them, you are less likely to be fooled by them and turn back. So his attack is intense at the beginning. And I know a lot of people that start serving God, and it gets harder instead of easier. And they say, this is not what I signed up for. I thought God was supposed to fix everything. I thought God was supposed to make my life better. But what he's done is ever since I've served God, it's gotten worse. And I know people that turn back before salvation comes, before the fullness of salvation comes. And they turn back because it gets harder before it gets easier. And withstanding temptation in the early days of our Christian faith is probably the most difficult that it'll ever be. And I'm not saying it ever gets easy to withstand temptation, and the temptations get more complex and things like that. But I really do think that we're not used to we're not used to withstanding temptation. We're used to giving into temptation. And so withstanding temptation and standing up against it, doing God's will, even against the flow of that temptation, is hardest at the beginning. And a lot of people give up. And a lot of people say, God, this isn't what I signed up for, and do basically exactly what the Israelites do. And then Moses believes this lie. And so one of the things I talk to people about when I'm discipling a young believer is I say, this is going to happen. If you're getting baptized, if you've just made a commitment to Christ, the enemy wants to destroy that. The enemy wants to stop this movement toward God. And he's going to do everything he can. He's going to throw everything at you. I see this usually the few weeks surrounding somebody who gets a new local license and responds to a call to ministry. My experience is, of all the people that have entered into ministry and then turned back and fallen back into sin, lost a license or credential, my experience is more people do that within the first month of having a local license than at any other time during their ministry. And I'm not saying it doesn't happen that people fall in ministry later, because it does. People fall when they're ordained and when they've been in ministry 20 and 30 years. But not near as many people as fall within the first month of receiving their local license, in my experience. And the reason is because the enemy is throwing everything at them right now while it's early on, while they're still weak. And the question is, what do we do when it gets harder, when we do the will of God? Do we turn back and say, this isn't the way it was supposed to be? Like the Israelites do when they come to Moses and Aaron, like Moses does when he goes to God after that. So number 7 says, how do you respond when there's opposition to God's plan and the call he has placed on your life? And I think it's really important to be prepared, because a lot of times when we begin to do the will of God, this is exactly what we face right at the beginning, and it gets worse before it gets better. And we need to be in such relationship with God, trust in God, that we may come back and say, God, are you sure? Am I on the right path? Search me, O Lord, and see if there be any wicked way in me. Did I do something wrong to cause this? But at some point, if the answer is no, you're right on the right track, then we need to say, okay, then I'm going to stand up even amidst this opposition, because I know you're faithful. And that's it takes faith, and it is a discipline, and sometimes it's a mental and spiritual discipline I know that this is what's going on, and I know that despite how this makes me feel and how much I don't like being attacked, I know that I'm in the will of God, and I'm going to stand. The scripture says, and when you've done everything else, to stand.